my name is Erin Valaire. I am an MSML alum from 2021. So some familiar faces, some new, which is really great to be here. I am the current president of the MSML Champions Group, which is an official student organization that really focuses on building, developing the Graziadio community, continuing to network and learn and leverage each other. So even though we are program specific, we really are just here for the whole community and want to give back and continue growing and learning together. Today we have a really fun, I like to call these hours a lunch and learn, where we get to hear from an expert in a topic that allows us to do just that. So to continue our growth journey together. Today we have Andrew Deutscher joining us, who is the founder and CEO of, or founder and president of Regenerate, which Regenerate focuses on really your energy and how important energy is. That energy is our most important resource, not time. And we can actually utilize our lives and time and all of that great stuff better if we actually focus on regenerating our energy. Today, he's going to introduce us to, it's just an introduction to his body of work. And it's typically taught for individuals, teams, leaders in the workplace. So it will be a really great hour that we have going. We'll have hopefully a few minutes for some Q&A and we can kind of keep the conversation going. So with that, one of the best humans I know, Andrew Deutscher, can kick us off.
Erin, thank you so much. It is great to be with you all. I see we just carried into 2 screens, so that's definitely fun. And yes, from an energy perspective, if you feel like lighting up your camera and coming in and saying hello and bringing your personal self into this, I think from an overall energy and connection standpoint, we would love it. Completely your option. So in preparing for this, Erin and I were talking about, the aspects around the work that we do inside of organizations and what's going on in the workplace around all this craziness with hybrid work and remote and changing trajectory of the workplace since the pandemic and all those things that circulate in our worlds all of the time while we're navigating our personal and professional lives. And I thought for part of that, we would just put that aside for a moment and we can come back to that. And I'm happy to continue the dialogue around how we work inside of organizations with that effort. But where we thought it would make the most sense in introducing you to this material, and it's a body of work that precedes me and predates me for quite some time. So it's exciting just in its efficacy over centuries, not just recent decades. But just the reality to make this personal for you, because energy is personal. You are the steward and gatekeeper of your energy. And oftentimes we may lose sight of that or not fully understand how to harness that. So today I hope to bring in just a few concepts, a few beliefs, maybe skills, behaviors, knowledge, maybe even just an attitude of something that you kind of can take away from here in a really practical way that maybe just has you think a little bit differently about the way that you approach your work and your life, because they are inextricable. So I'm going to share my screen, and it's always fun to have somebody just throw me your preferred emoji just to make sure that everyone can see that screen and I can know that we're tracking here. Nice, thank you. A love one definitely works. Great. So we started in the chat with something you're looking forward to this weekend, and it initiated a dialogue. But it's just really fascinating. I think you all know this, just how quickly energy can move in the human system. We are going to get at that in some scientific and also practical terms, but even just putting our focus for a moment on, okay, it's Friday, what am I looking forward to this weekend? And if you pay attention to it, that quick injection of maybe it's a little bit of a dopamine squirt, right? Maybe it's just a little serotonin appetite there. Maybe there's just some feel-good aspect when we put our minds in a place of something that we're looking forward to. And just how quickly that can happen and how much in control of that we really are. So what I'm going to introduce today is really around, in the short time that we have, 3 key goals of where I really want to square this up with you, and love to use the chat. I don't expect for this to be one way. and would love to interact with you. So feel free to come on audio, feel free to use the chat. I have a couple of helpers here to make sure that we're monitoring that. But really center in on number one, understand the role of energy. It is a very important resource in our lives to actually build our functional capacity. So in any aspect of our lives, what we do, how we do it, requires at its core glucose and oxygen, but more broadly, how you think about energy. It requires energy to do things and to activate. The second thing is really developing then an awareness and an appreciation for how our energy can shift and to gain more conscious awareness of our energy states. Sideline, good news, there's only 4, so we get to talk about it pretty neatly. And not just how your energy impacts you when you really stop and think about whatever it is that you're feeling at any given point in time, but probably even more important, how does that impact your spouse? How does that impact your brother or sister, your friend, your colleague? How are you showing up around your energy in that sense? And then the third piece, which I can tell you for me, without going deep into my personal story, but this has been a journey for me, just getting to this work and learning about it. And one of the most fascinating takeaways that I had as a senior executive at Sony when I first was acquainted with this material was very much from a work construct. And that was, if you understand and can appreciate the relationship between stress, and not all stress is bad, but between stress and recovery, that is how we generate sustainable performance. We'll often hear from participants in our sessions about the number of hours that they're working. I don't know, if you're really tracking that kind of thing or you don't want to think too much about that, but if you were to just take a stab at it, how many hours in a given week? And yes, that would include after dinner, checking back online, maybe Saturday mornings, getting a couple of hours in, or maybe 2 hours before your vacation day. But if you were to just take a stab at it, how many hours a week do you think there is literal work going on or just mind share around work that needs to be done? Just in the chat, so we get kind of a temperature there. Wow, Aaron, that was like incredibly quick. I don't know if you use AI for that. Too many. Okay, maybe we just go with that, right? 50 plus. There we go. Yeah, so what's pretty interesting now as you look at some of these things is we actually know there's a certain number of hours in the knowledge economy that when we go past that, promotes exhaustion and burnout. And when we can stay actually within that number, actually increases our focus and productivity. And we know that number now to be roughly in the low 40 hours. And you all know this intuitively, whether it's a given day of work or you get later into the work week where you have what we call diminishing returns. You're still working, you're just not nearly as productive. So in this third area, we'll go a little bit more into that, is this relationship between stress and recovery. So I would say, again, in the short time that we have, if there's one main piece that you come out of here with, is keep your antenna up over the next few days and the next couple of weeks around things that invite stress into your life and how energy consuming they are, and the degree to which you're really conscious about refueling that tank and replenishing yourself. Because that is really going to be your equation to sustain the level of performance that you expect of yourself. And I'm sure the companies and the people that you work with would like to see from you. So let's start just kind of setting the tone here a little bit. So burnout is now classified in the World Health Organization and disease classification. This was actually interesting in that it was identified and introduced into the manual in 2019. Just so happens, a year before the pandemic, right? It wasn't like the pandemic made that much better, right? But this was something that was right before the pandemic. And really the definition, which I find not to be the most practical or accessible, but this is what we have so far for that, is that it's a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So how can we sort of translate that into something a little more practical where you can really get at this for yourself And that's going to invite a question that I have for you. Because we know that this is not really a new thing. In fact, occupational burnout was a term that was first identified in the 1970s. We have progressively worked longer hours ever since then as a society and as a societal workplace. And again, the pandemic didn't do us many favors on that. We're working longer hours now. So for you, though, when you really connect to the topic, how do you know when things start to get away from you? And I just want you to think about that for a moment. I'll give you one example, because recently a participant in my session was talking about visiting a client site. He got into his car and was probably less than a mile from his house and stopped at a stoplight. And he started to feel beads of sweat come off his head. His heart was starting to palpitate. He got really nervous around that, wasn't sure what was happening, never experienced that before. He looked to the car to his left to see, maybe I need to flag this person down. I could be in trouble here. And then over to his right, he was familiar with an urgent care center. And he remembers at that moment looking at his watch because he realized he was going to be late for the client meeting, as if that even mattered at that point, but that was his instinct. And he went to the urgent care center, and good news was he had a panic attack. But this was after successive few weeks of not a lot of sleep, not much rest in between, some travel and jet lag and things that you throw into the mix that exacerbated a spend of energy where he started to get into that red line, as you see there. So there's a number of ways that we can overheat and where things could start getting away from us. Unfortunately for us, we don't really have a dashboard, although technology companies are quickly on the move, right, to try to show us these indicators, whether it's an aura or a Whoop band or things like that, and they're helpful. But overall, what really matters is how intuitive you are, right, to when things start to get away from you. So how do you know? How do you know when you are about to overheat? All right, got some stuff in the chat, and feel free to speak to it as well. Absence of delays, mental hurdles. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so just take a look at them. I'm not going to read them all out loud, but as with anything, when you see enough answers to this question, you realize that there are classification schemes, and you can start to categorize these things that could seem, very unique, and they are unique to us in certain ways, but they're not unknown, right? Many people can experience things that are like that. What do you notice about some of these answers if you were to roll them up into a few categories? I know, all of you business school or alumni of business school, you like to do critical thinking. So help me with what you notice that is in common with all of these things.
I just say that the common thing I see is a strong collection of like cognitive process delays or pauses or
Yeah,
challenges.
Greg, spot on with that. Yeah, there's definitely a good number of these that we would just say are mental. Cognitive, focus, concentration, tension. What else is in there outside of the mental?
There's physical signs as well. People are noticing some body awareness on changes.
Yes, Heidi, exactly. Yeah, you see a bunch of those right in there. Even physically, we could call it mentally zoning out, but you can kind of feel your body in that zone out mode as well. Yeah, and then the other one to point out here is emotional, right? The irritability, the anxiousness, when something small becomes big, our perception of things and how looming they may be. And then, of course, there's always the famous, well, I'm worried about this, so I just need to be worried about worrying about it. And now we get into double jeopardy around some of those things, right? Meredith, you hear me on that? That's certainly resonant for a lot of people. And then just the quickness to anger or impatience. So we will see them physically, we'll see them emotionally, and we'll see them mentally. And you all have populated plenty of really good specific answers around that. So Greg, question or comment? And you're on mute.
Sure. I was just going to follow up. When you mentioned that small things become big, I would also say maybe there's some tendency for detachment on those loved ones around us, where big things that should be a priority become small as well. And we miss those.
That is a great call. I would ask you for an example around that, but I don't want to punish you and have to revisit that reality.
Listening to my daughter, yeah. Listening to my daughter after she had a rough day at school, right? Should be a priority, but if I'm burdened with work and I'm overloaded, I don't give it the due priority and the care and love that I should.
Oh, nice call out, and love the self-awareness around that and the honesty. Frankly, I think that's amazing. You know, you have plenty of situations where people are coming in with things that are important to them that when we're in those states, just not that important to us. It's not because we don't care or we want to be there for them. It's just we're tired, right? And it's not really that relevant in that moment for us. And then, of course, we're not fully aware of the impact that's having, right? Or in the spaces of where that's happening. So part of this is really around, we're going to talk about elements of self-care and things that you already know. So to touch on that for a moment, the question is, we know these things, right? We know in those areas where things can tend to get away from us, where we might even have that, even if it's somewhat reactive, and a lot of this is unconscious, there's a piece of us that's always governing around, I don't want to show up that way, or I know that I need to get more rest, or I know that I should probably turn the TV off right now and get more sleep. But like, what is it? What really gets in the way of those basic elements of self-care, even if you were to just do some of the few very basic things that could really help you better manage your energy? What stops us? Lack of planning. Yeah. Meredith, guilt, that's a big one. Right? The big three: fear, anger, guilt, right? Things associated with that. And is the guilt, maybe you could say a little bit more about that, but just if you're doing something for yourself, that means you're not doing something for somebody else.
100%. And I think too that there's all these extra projects that still need to be completed. And if I'm taking time for myself and those projects aren't getting completed and it gets farther and farther behind, big component.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the worry about things like, what if like I'm resting and taking care of myself and that actually doesn't relate to getting things done more effectively or productively, or so hear you on that. Important difference, right? You're highlighting there, Meredith, in terms of difference between self-care and selfishness, and how we could confuse the two at oftentimes. One, we clearly know we're not trying to be a detriment to others or take from others, right? We're trying to make sure that we are fueled with the kind of energy that we need to show up in ways that we want to. And that's not from a place of guilt at all. I mean, I remember, especially when I was traveling a lot with Sony, that my only real refuge, if I was going to get my head right around my kids who were really little at that time, I said, Saturday mornings, 9 o'clock, I'm going to do the yoga thing. My wife was supportive about that, but she was home with 2 little kids, you know, all week. And it was like, you're home for the weekend, so here you go, kind of thing. And of course, that was what I wanted too. I wanted that time, but I knew that I needed that morning, or at least that part of it, to get my head right and to make sure that I was going to be the kind of parent that I wanted to be in that space, right? So could feel guilty about doing it, but certainly I think we know every time we do it and we come back a little bit stronger and feeling a little more freed and focused and more in what we're going to refer to as a performance state, everyone really benefits from that and they appreciate it. And then we can teach that. We can teach that as an important component, right? So let's talk about just fundamentally here what it is that we're talking about, or the problem that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to guess that for many of you, and I talk with Aaron, the different companies you represent and all of the ongoing education and curiosity and growth and learning appetite that you have and impact that you want to have in the world, that demands in your life are likely high right now. Is that fair? You say, with everything going on? Can I also assume that those demands, you expect those to rise, continue to rise in the next 2 to 3 years? You think so, for sure? Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Got the thumbs up there. the third question is really integral to the work that we do at Regenerate. And it's this, do you expect your capacity, that's literally the fuel in your tank, to rise right along up and meet that demand? And that's sort of where we don't get as many hands raised, right? We recognize that demand is high and it's still going higher, but when it comes to our capacity, we're not so sure. In fact, there's a certain age that we get to when we start to move against it gravity-wise, which is to say, we don't have as much cardiovascular capacity, right, in the absence of exercise. We don't have as much physical strength, right, in the absence of strength training or work on our balance. And that's just in the physical dimension alone. So what age do you think that is where that starts to happen? You're not going to like how young the answer is to this question, but we're here for reality. Yeah, you all have it. It's in the early 30s, somewhere between 30 and 35, just from a cardiovascular standpoint and strength base, if we're not intervening at that point. And then you have to consider what happens typically at that time in our lives. What is going on? We start to usher in more demands, don't we? We go from a job to a career. Maybe we find a mate at that point, or we extend to a family. And so as those things tend to come in, our instinct is to do what? Less of the things that we derive the most energy from. We start sacrificing sleep, right? We stop moving as much, all in the name of trying to get more done. So I really want to challenge that equation and try to flip that on its head to a degree, that the capacity side of the equation, if we want to meet growing and complex and increased demands, the capacity side becomes really important. And because of the fact it doesn't really happen until our early to mid 30s, we, for the most part, taken capacity for granted. We assume either there will be always more where that came from, and we're expected to juggle more tasks and stay more connected. So it's really not that much of a surprise if we're feeling fatigued or overwhelmed or anxious, where that's coming from. That's the root of it, is demands exceeding our capacity. That's actually what we mean, generally what we mean when we say we're stressed. Perceived demands are higher than our capacity to meet those demands. So the problem, we'll call it, is sort of this open-ended, we don't really have many boundaries anymore. In fact, they were eradicating even before the pandemic, in terms of work life and number of hours and ability or challenges with disconnecting from work and those things. We borrow the Einstein quote here because we've been trying to solve the problem of relentless demand in some of the same ways that are not getting us to a really good solution. So when we think about the resource that we primarily rely upon to get more things done, what is that resource for you? What do you tend to rely on for the most part still today in trying to solve for these increased demands in your life? Anybody want to take a stab at that one? When it comes to getting more things done, the primary way in which you do that. Yeah, Meredith, that's coffee. Nice, Patricia. Coffee, more coffee. Yeah. Just get to a point, but you know that over-caffeinated feeling, don't you? It's like, that only gets you so far. Yeah, so there's ways that we try to cope with some of that, but overall, like if you think about, do you borrow an hour of sleep to, say that's going to give me one more hour of productivity? Do you tend to multitask? Do you skip meals? Do you feel yourself rushing through things for the scarcity aspect of time that we're generally operating around, that time-based paradigm, that time-based model? So challenge with time, we all know. You learned this before you got to business school. Time is finite. It's only 168 hours in a week. So we're not getting any more of that. And there's this interesting thing with time, isn't there? That the longer hours we work, it almost seems like it begets even more work. So it used to be we'd work longer hours and it'd be like, oh, wow, I actually got it all done. I feel accomplished. I could actually maybe see white space in my email box where I didn't have to scroll. I got it down to just like one, I don't even have to scroll, one move. Like that was it, right? We feel accomplished. That doesn't exist anymore, right? Now we just play an email to search for sent file and trash file, and like it's all over the place. So time is a finite resource. And when we really look at an alternative way to view this, we're introducing the concept here of energy. Now, 3 things you should understand about energy in the human system. Number 1, we can expand our energy. That's a pretty cool aspect of our energy, unlike time that sits outside of us and moves in a linear base. The other thing about energy is we can stem energy depletion. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when I share another construct for you, but in physical, emotional, mental energy, if you think about the ways that you drain your own energy or proverbially get in your own way, there's lots of ways we deplete our own energy, right? Choices that we make throughout the day. The most fundamental tenet or attribute of energy that I find to be the most compelling is the third one that I'm going to share with you on the screen, and that is it's renewable. What we really don't talk as much about today in the workplace, or I think even in the education world, is the general basic human operating system around what it means to go from just living at a base level to ultimately really trying to thrive, is this relationship that human beings have, unlike any other species, where we actually can renew our energy very intentionally. There are plenty of species out there that sort of do it intuitively, and if we were to model it, you would really see it. The fundamental premise of it, as human beings, we're meant to spend and recover energy. It's kind of boring if you were to just tell someone your life legacy at the end was, hey, I spent and recovered energy. That's what I did for 80 years. But underneath it all, and really what is going with you the entire way, is this relationship. How you're spending and recovering energy is happening all the time. It's just getting an awareness inside of that that can really be the game changer. So, human energy, what do we mean by that? Good news is this is not a definition I made up. This is how it's defined. And you'll notice a couple of keywords here. Internal again, internal strength and vitality that is required for sustained physical, emotional, and mental activity. So, importance of sustainable and internal, right? If we're going to meet the growing demands that we're faced with in the external world, that will come from our internal resources. And if we want to be going at this pace for more than just through 2023, and your companies or the people that you work with have already, because we're working on some of them, 2040, 2050 kind of agendas, and people think about the rate at which they're working right now and having to sustain that pace, sustainable performance becomes a really important aspect of that, because we can perform and go really hard for a period of time. We can't do that, in the infinite. So we need to think about actually how we are recovering through all of this. So from an energy standpoint, it's really not the hours that we invest that determines value. It is the energy we put into those hours that determines ultimate value and value creation. Certainly, we were talking, Dr. Ralph, at the beginning of the call, just around creativity and innovation. But when you think about it from this standpoint, energy into hours is where quality and creativity and innovation come from. If people are going to bring the best of themselves to those kinds of creative expression, that requires obviously a lot of good, ready, steady energy for that. So this is always an interesting one when participants or individuals and leaders look at this, because they'll say, yeah, that makes complete sense. And we don't operate by that assumption at all. In fact, we actually want to know where our people are, or what they're doing, or if they're remote, how productive they are, or how connected to the work that they are. And there's not really the level of trust that we're talking about here in terms of really encouraging an energy into hours mindset and construct for a team and an organization where work happens. It's so many different time and location modifications now that we just want to make sure that people are equipped and energized to do their best work. Let me pause here for a moment before I move into the actual energy in the human system part and how that works, and some discussion around that, because that is definitely a more interactive piece. So I want to just stop here and see if we're tracking or if there's any questions or anything that's on your mind. Okay, very good. So keep going, Andrew. We're good? Okay, nice. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to this. It's a construct. It's a mental model. It's really a way of thinking about your energy. So this is sort of your practical and actionable awareness builder and takeaway. Jim Lair, you'll see his name in the corner. He is one of the pioneers of kind of the modern day energy management. He worked with professional tennis players, most notably. He also worked with a few Olympic athletes, and Dan Jensen is one of them. But his greatest work, his love, his passion was inside the tennis game. And it was pretty interesting because he actually decided to monitor the heart rates of top tennis players from the side of the court and just see how their biorhythms fluctuated with their performance and times where they were under pressure. And what he noticed, which was a pretty fascinating discovery and one that he then brought over to the corporate workplace for all of us to understand, was the reality that great performers in the tennis game recover really well between points. In fact, he was looking so much for technical aspects on the court. And when the data kind of hit him in the face, he realized that the set of sequence behaviors that great players do in the very short time between points, that was helping them regain their composure, their mental focus, and their physical energy just through some breath work pretty quickly in those 20 seconds, was a differentiator. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If you think about athletes at that level of any discipline and how good they are technically, what is going to separate, what's going to be the competitive advantage, was actually how they recovered. And so he took those insights over to the corporate world. If you want to read a little bit more about his work, he was featured in a seminal HBR article called Manage Your Energy, Not Your Time. And it's about the science of stamina. And that's really where a lot of this work and what I'm sharing with you here is derived from. What he realized to communicate this is that there's really only 4 ways that we can feel. In other words, 4 ways in which we have energy currency. And if you think about energy really practically, energy is how you feel. So how you feel is how you perform. It's not you perform a certain way and that's going to give you a feeling. It's actually, and this is the hardest thing that I work with my 9th grader on, who happens to be a tennis player, is you could actually feel like you're winning before you start winning. And so the understanding of that type of thing that's so dynamic in the human system around energy is, if you understand how you feel, it is the most reliable indicator of how you are showing up in the moment. So it's hard to buffer that, right? We may think, well, we're not going to show it or people won't know, but the reality is our energy speaks louder, right? So 4 ways that you can feel: negative to positive, and then for the purpose of this discussion, we'll call it low to high. But we all know we have spend states of energy for better and for worse, and we have recovery states of energy for better and for worse. So anytime you want to just check in, what's my felt level of energy right now? How am I feeling? What is a word that can describe that? You can locate yourself pretty well. That is a really good use of energy when you determine for yourself, does my feeling state match to what I'm trying to do in the moment? And is that appropriate under these circumstances? If something is mildly disappointing and you get angry about it and that disconnect, not a good use of energy. So this really helps you sort of calibrate around energy levels. So let's just start with this. When you're working toward a clearly defined goal and you feel you have the resources to accomplish that mission, what corner of these quadrants would you be in? Where does that feeling exist? Yeah, Dr. Sumter, this is a good time for a question. Sure, while people are popping that in there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just this is so fascinating. First of all, this is just so great. And that I think you answered my question. It was about the positive and negative, if that's like emotional valence. Is that the feelings of experiencing positive or negative emotions along with the energy, or feeling those emotions in a high or low way? Or if you could just explain a little bit more about what the positive, the negative spectrum means.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. That's what it is. It is the energy charge to the emotion. So what I'm going to share are a few different, like, let's get at it this way, if I can. If we say that upper right are the feelings that we have when we feel empowered and challenged in the healthiest sense of the word, right? It doesn't mean that it's easy, but it feels like maybe we're surrounded by a group of people that we can accomplish something larger than our own self-interest. We're resourced to do it. And you're working toward that clearly defined goal. We know those emotions generally sit in that upper right state, right? They're definitely positive, and they have an energy consuming nature to them. So what would be a few words that you might put into that upper right quadrant? What would that look like? And I think this will answer your question, and probably the question that you asked that a lot of people have in their mind. What do we mean by high, low, negative, positive? What are a few of the words that would sit in that upper right corner?
Maybe enthusiastic.
Yep. Yeah, keep going in that constellation. Or anyone else chime in. Yeah, Heidi, like, I've got this feeling, right? Excited, optimistic. So sharing a few words there, even when you look at those words, has a feel good, sort of high positive nature to them. So when we look at each of these different states, they're going to have from negative to positive. That's usually easy to identify. And then the charge, even if it's positive, is it a consuming you kind of energy? Which is to say, if you think about, if I'm really feeling excited and enthusiastic, I might be able to feel that for a while, but I can't feel that in a perpetual state, at least not if I'm authentic to it, right? Those emotions, because they're driven by hormones, right, tend to dissipate over time. So fulfilled, excited, all those kinds of words would really put you squarely in that upper right. So does that help answer the question a little bit, Dr. Sumter, in that regard? And then as we move around, we'll start to see this come to life even more. So what's a good name for that upper right-hand state? What would you call it if you have, any number of emotions that you've shared here that would depict that feeling state of what Heidi put, like, I got this, I'm ready to go? It's a good word for that state when you're feeling that. If you had to say to someone, when I'm in that state, I feel this. Positivity, great, connected. Yeah, I mean, you're all over it. Confident, inspired, motivated. Yeah, good news, they all roll up to performance. That's when we're in a performance state. And again, remember, this model originally started with tennis players before it moved into self-management and leadership and having discussions like this. So it derives from a performance state kind of vocabulary. Now, here's the reality. We don't always feel that way, do we? So if we're not in that state, where do we tend to be spending a good chunk of time? And you look at the rest of this makeup here, where would you say is, hey, maybe this is an area where I do spend a lot of time, or I experience, or I observe in the workplace? There's a lot of this kind of energy going on. How would you describe it, even before we name the category? Is it upper left, or lower right? Yeah. Meredith, you get the game so far, huh? Right. Now, what's the problem with that, would you say, overall?
For me personally, it's depleting. It's exhausting to be in that space all the time.
Yeah. So what are some emotions that you would describe? And not just you, Meredith, but for anybody. What are some of the emotions in that upper left state? Yeah, Nicole, it's a great point.
I would say just feeling extremely exhausted. And then that's kind of where your productivity productivity level just goes down.
Yeah, so here's the thing again about this is a good opportunity to clarify sort of the energy charge, because when you look at some of these words of there's a high energy consumption to some of these words. And there was a really good point here in the chat too, that I want to bring out. Nicole said, if you spend too much time there, you're just tired, exhausted all the time. So what happens here, like what's actually happening inside the human system is we may feel those kinds of emotions, right? We're agitated, we're frustrated. They're a high negative energy kind of experience, and they are all consuming. And they will naturally lead to a different state. But when you're in that state, you feel it, right? You feel it's, in a sense, the fight or flight reactivity that goes along with that. So you're still trying to work, right? You're still engaged. It's just not the healthiest kind of energy that we're bringing to the equation. But we can still operate from there. Why are we still able to actually function and operate from there? Even if it's throwing off not the kinds of impact that we want to have or the value that we want to create, how are we still able to do it? Just really basic from what you see in the makeup itself. Because remember, here you're still on the high side of energy, right? You're still in a spend state of energy. So there's still energy in the system. It's just different kind of energy, right? It's more reactive, unconscious, unhealthy kind of energy that's going to have health implications for you. And then we know the relational implications to it. So, of course, if we're in that state for very long, as Nicole, you pointed it out, we will slowly move down into, getting ahead of myself there, the lower left-hand state. So we call the upper left-hand state, we call that survival state, right? Very different than a performance state. And you all know what that feels like, right? And we know that if you're tired at the end of a day, and you really were to look back on different moments, if you were tracking, hey, I was in performance here, or I was in survival here, I was trying to get back to performance here. Like, this is kind of the narrative that's going on inside of our activities every day. If we're set back or thrown off, we are trying to get back to that performance state. So we will try to toggle back over there. And sometimes it's really hard, right? Or we're trying to fake it till we make it kind of thing. But if we're spending a lot of time in those two states, there is the reality for you. You're going to be tired, right? That's just a very simple byproduct and outgrowth of spending a lot of time in those two states. So when we look at a considerable amount of spend in that upper left-hand state, that will slowly bring us to a lower left-hand state. What would we call that lower left box, would you say? Yeah, Jonathan, right. So that's really what we mean when we talk about burnout, right? Burnout oftentimes doesn't happen in a day or a week. It happens from successive accretive visiting of that upper left-hand state. That's most people's reality, at least in the workplace, of how they eventually get to that burnout state. So let's remember, though, from an energy management perspective, all of these are appropriate under certain circumstances. They are all wired into the human system for good reasons. We're supposed to feel burnout in certain cases. It's just we're experiencing now that at levels that aren't as appropriate because of the rate at which we are pushing people and ourselves into frequency of that survival state. So if you think about survival state initially as, well, what's that appropriate for? That's an important question to answer because it does exist and it's appropriate for very specific circumstances. And if we're going to go there and we're going to pay the price of our own health and our relationships, and you see it's on the opposite side of performance, so it doesn't help our performance, we know that. That's an expensive toll. So when does it make sense to go there and to be in that state? What do you think? What would be appropriate for that? Do you work in finance? No.
No, I was just trying to think of something that you have to do that you're not thrilled about. And so the adrenaline, if there's like a deadline, right, you're about to.
Yep.
So I run a family foundation. We have IRS regulations at the end of the year that we have to have given away 5% of our endowment. And it's a floating number, right? Because they're always calculating. So it's kind of like a high stress situation. We have to make sure that we've given away the appropriate number. So I was thinking that it doesn't feel like a performance-based response, right? Get this or else we're penalized.
Right. And so how many times is a great example? Do you find yourselves or your team sort of working frenetically to try to advance work agendas, right, inside of a space of anxiety and frustration and challenge and misdirect and moving targets and all those things? And we'll hear a lot of that kind of thing of like, well, isn't survival be appropriate when we do have this kind of vigilance that we need or deadlines looming? And those are all important things. I don't want to undermine any of them. Just from the reality of why it's wired into the human system is for the reason that it shows you on the screen. It's when your survival is at stake. So this doesn't mean now you're only going to go to survival state when you're in a survival-based situation. But I would love for you to pause and consider next time you go to that state to understand the consequences, and is your survival literally at stake? Otherwise, not a great use of energy. When I first started to get into this, I know I was very mindful about how often I was visiting survival state, so the frequency, the duration, and the intensity. And that's something to just sort of take with you, because it doesn't mean you're never going to go there. But in the ways when you do go there, how often is it? What is the intensity of it for you? And when you're in it, how long are you in it? And work on those aspects. And instead of trying to just toggle back and fight your way back to performance, because that's still energy draining, there's another way. And the other way is to find this access to the lower right-hand state. Challenge in the workplace is that this is a countercultural place to inhabit. It's also pretty counterintuitive. The understanding, as we do now from not just sports science, but performance science overall, is that the lower right-hand state isn't just the set of activities and behaviors for you to recover your energy from energy depletion in the upper left-hand state. It actually turns out it's the most reliable way to influence a consistent performance state. So news for you, right? Recovery in and of itself is not slacking. It's not taking a break just because you're too tired and you're not willing to work. It's actually to optimize your performance. It's a performance-based strategy. So when we look at understanding regenerative practices, what we're looking at is, gosh, if I'm really in a state day to day where I'm moving through these energy quadrants, how do I do a better job of trying to marry up the circumstances to the appropriate level of energy? And that's just a continued awareness builder around that. So to understand that we're actually designed to be rhythmic. It's how we're created, how we're structured. When we're faced with working with devices and technologies and always on modalities, we start to think that we too are supposed to operate the same way. And we sort of get lost in this kind of human technology conundrum because we're so tethered to the devices that we rely upon. But in terms of our operating system, it's very different. We're actually meant to spend and recover energy. Josephine Arendt is a chronobiologist, and I would not have known her if I wasn't into this kind of work, but she is famous for really first noting that every system in the human body pulses. So if you think about your nervous system or your digestive system or your cardiovascular system or your endocrine system, all of them have a very common underlying nature to them, and that is they spend and recover. They have a regular systematic way of doing that. And any time that they're off kilter from that, we're going to experience that either in the form of sickness, disease, all the way through just irritability and mental fog. So I'll leave this as part of just the last couple of minutes of closing out. a couple of things to really think about just from an awareness standpoint. We don't really need to sit here and talk about some of the nature of the behaviors that you can do. I'm really happy to entertain that as a follow-up conversation, and I encourage you to sign up for our email list where we push out lots of strategies for recovery and how to regenerate in the course of a busy life. But it really is around this idea. You could recover very efficiently. Now, I'm not saying not to take your sabbatical and to take your full vacations. Those are incredibly important. But for today's discussion, it's really around just the practical day-to-day reality that if you want to be as high performing as this machine is, and I believe you're all very high performing, that requires a very good hand at maintenance and recovery and recognizing when that flag to come in, whether you do that for yourself or you rely on some others when you're out on the track of life to just say, hey, I got to come in for a little bit, but I could do that efficiently, right? I can pit efficiently. And what you realize is that is a strategy to not just finish the race, but to win the race. Those opportunities do not come about without what you see right here on the screen. The same is true in our lives. It's just sometimes the crowd noise and the thrill of the chase that you're in can cause hesitancy around wanting to or needing to come off the track and to recover. With that, as I'm kind of winding down on some time, I'm just going to jump on a couple of quick slides here. And I'll finish you off with this last piece so that you can just sort of take this practical, actionable takeaway. I'm sure many of you have heard of circadian rhythm, the 24-hour system that's outside of us. We're not as familiar typically with this aspect called the ultradian rhythm. It's actually, sleep researchers discovered this about a decade after they discovered circadian rhythm. And as it turns out, that rhythm actually in our sleep cycles recapitulates itself during our waking hours. So everything that you do throughout the course of a day will implicate how well you sleep at night. How well you sleep at night will implicate everything you do throughout the day. Now, inside of the day, we will tend to start anything that we do at a higher physiological arousal point. And over the course of, it's roughly 90 minutes, we will slowly move down into a trough. Now, you could either multitask at that point, you can try to push through, you can grab another cup of coffee or a sugary drink, or you can just pay attention to your body's natural rhythms and get up from your desk, get a little bit of a walk, get some hydration, reset yourself for the next 60 to 90 minutes that's in front of you. Now, that's hard to do sometimes with competing agendas and different schedules, but just something for you to modulate around thinking, leaving from here, what are some ways in which I could really intentionally but efficiently recover? So I wish I had a little bit more time, but we're almost up on time. So I'm concluding a couple of slides short, but I just want to pause here to just see if there's any questions in the chat. I want to turn it back over to Erin for just some final housekeeping and any announcements, and would love to just continue the dialogue with all of you, either one-on-one or another group, or ways that you can interact with our company. So any questions? And Nicole, that's really interesting. If you see that last piece in the chat, everybody see that? Yeah, culturally, it's just really very interesting. When we do this work in different places, I mean, much of this, what I appreciated about it is that it's pretty universal, right? When it comes to human performance. So it's just different cultural views on work and rest. Questions? Yes, Ashley.
I'm curious because your point about technology and how we're kind of trying to kind of be at the same level of the demands of technology in our current state. But as we advance with like the emergence of ChatGPT, for example, which is going to be alleviating a lot of that, us like maybe doing those mindless tasks or just alleviating the demands of general day-to-day work, because I've already seen it in my work right now. So I'm curious, do you think that's going to help balance out that recovery that we can potentially get because we won't have to dedicate so much of our thinking on things that are kind of beyond us to a certain degree that could be facilitated with AI?
That's a phenomenal question. I don't know how long you've been in the workplace, but I remember somebody asking me that question when smartphones were launched. And, you know, we went from Blackberries to iPhones and, you know, shouldn't that make things a little bit easier now? So I think you get the answer to my question here is every time we think that there's something that's going to sort of help us on that side of it, it's this double-edged sword. You know, it's like it just creates more either chaos or frenetic behaviors around just trying to do more in another space. It just moves. It doesn't solve it. So I think that's really interesting. Also, an important part of energy is, and this is another session that we talk about and teach, but an important part of your energy is actually doing hard things. And when we don't do hard things, we can atrophy. So like going to Google for a quick answer, or, you know, a kid getting their AI script on a homework assignment, when those things are that easy and they're not doing the hard stuff, they don't build the resilience and the energy adaptation. So it kind of hurts in that way too. It's a great question. Heidi.
I think Aaron sort of answered the question. It was specific to the ultradian rhythm. Is that, did I understand correctly that you're essentially saying it would be most helpful to schedule your day around 90-minute cycles, essentially?
Exactly. Ideally, the closer you can get to that, and just recognize maybe I have a 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute strategy to try to acknowledge and honor that recovery period or whatever that looks like, then yeah, you're doing yourself a favor because now you're aligning with your biological rhythms. To take that further, that's where we can get into some interesting areas around chronotype, because most of us are meant to work well in the mornings, but there's a subset of people who work better at night, and how they think about ultradian rhythms is a little bit different. But yes, for most of us, just doing that piece in and of itself will have a huge dividend for you.
Are there
Well, this is
any
an
other
awesome
questions?
group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really incredible, really amazing. I did put Andrew's company's website in the chat as well. Andrew's also done a TED Talk. There's a lot of good resources out there. We're just really thrilled and honored that you guys can be here. As Nicole mentioned, as a community, we're always trying to do these events where we have a learning environment. Our next event will be in September. If anyone has any suggested topics that they want to go into, keynote speakers that they think would really serve our community, please feel free to email us at the email address that Nicole threw in the chat, which is the msmlchampions@gmail.com. Thank you guys. Hope you guys take a nice 20-minute break now.
And enjoy that stuff you're looking forward to this weekend. It was great to be with you all.